Welcome to the CCN Mexico Report podcast, an overview of Mexican legal, business, and political developments presented by the international law firm of Cascio Cavazos and Newton. The content presented is for information and educational purposes only and should not be understood as legal advice.
Welcome to the CCN Mexico Report podcast. I'm Rob Barnett. In 300 Palabras, Dr. Mario Melgar Adalid writes, "The war currently taking place in Ukraine has captured the world's attention. It has also impacted Mexico, regardless of how distant the conflict rages. Mexico condemned the attack on Ukraine before the United Nations Security Council, of which Mexico serves as a member. Despite its denunciation at the UN, Mexico has maintained a neutral position based on its established constitutional principles governing the conduct of foreign policy. Such principles include individuals' rights to self-determination, non-intervention, peaceful conflict resolution, prohibitions on the threat or use of force in international affairs, the legal equality of nations, international cooperation for development, and the fight for international peace and security. However, a careful review of these principles suggests that condemnation of the aggression occurring in Ukraine is not against Mexican constitutional provisions. On the contrary, numerous elements exist that would allow the country to support taking a tougher stance against the conflict. In fact, these constitutional principles stand for peaceful resolution of conflicts, non-intervention, prohibition of threat or use of force in international affairs, and the international cooperation for development and fight for international peace and security. Further, the world's current situation demands a proactive, not a passive and neutral position. After Russia invaded Ukraine, a large burden of the response to the conflict fell on the United States based on its status as a nuclear, economic, and military superpower. The United States has shown its leadership to NATO member countries and the world. Mexico should be no exception. Being the United States' main commercial partner, it is only natural and appropriate that Mexico display a less neutral expression and more energetic disapproval of the atrocities that are currently taking place in Ukraine." In the article Thermometer Político, Dr. Mario Melgar Adalid also writes, "Aside from the outcome of the recall election held throughout Mexico on April 10, 2022, to determine whether the president should complete his term, Mexico will hold local government elections in the states of Aguascalientes, Durango, Hidalgo, Oaxaca, Quintana Roo, and Tamaulipas. All these states play an important role in the national compact that governs the Mexican Republic. However, current conditions will focus public attention on a few of them, which will in turn raise the political temperature of the country. The big mystery is whether Morena, the party of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will continue to win elections and hold an increasing number of political positions. The approval rate of President López Obrador decreased 4 points from 62% at the beginning of the year to 58% in March of 2022. But such does not constitute an unequivocal indicator that voters will change their political preferences when elections are held on June 5, 2022. Of the 6 states being contested, the Partido Acción Nacional, or PAN, governs 3, Aguascalientes, Durango, and Tamaulipas. The Partido Revolucionario Institucional, or PRI, governs 2, Hidalgo and Oaxaca. And the Partido de la Revolución Democrática, or PRD, holds just 1, Quintana Roo. The ruling Morena party currently governs none of these 6 states. Therefore, in some ways, Morena has much to gain and nothing to lose. The other parties that form the political opposition will use their political capital to fight for increased support, particularly the PRI, which has maintained its bastion of supporters in traditionally pro-PRI states, such as Hidalgo and Oaxaca. Losing these states would present the PRI with an even bigger crisis than the one it faces now. The result of the presidential recall election will likely be an indicator of the results to expect in the June elections. However, 2 months is a long time in the volatile world of Mexican politics, and we shall soon see how the political thermometer in Mexico will behave. CCN attorneys Iker Dieguez and Fernanda Revilla write, Mexico adopts new official Mexican standard governing the labeling of textiles, clothing, accessories, and linens. On January 14, 2022, the Mexican Department of Economy published in the Official Journal of the Federation new official Mexican standard NOM 004 SE 2020 titled Commercial Information, Labeling of Textile Products, Clothing, its Accessories, and Linens. Such new set of rules, known as an NOM or NOM per its acronym in Spanish, serve to cancel NOM 004 SCFI from 2006. The new NOM will enter into force on January 14, 2023, and replace the current rules, which have been in force since August 20, 2006. The purpose of the new NOM is to establish the rules for providing detailed information to final consumers in packaging and labels of textile products, clothing, accessories, and linens for products imported and sold in Mexico. A summary of the key provisions in the new NOM include: the list of products exempted from compliance is now increased, including surgical masks, disposable clothing, textile laces and straps, among others. Provisions of NMX 029 Intex 2010, which governs textile industry intertwined textiles and auto-extinguishable fabric specifications, and ISO 13688 2013, governing protective clothing general requirements, are now incorporated as referenced regulations. Relevant definitions are now added, such as marketer, QR code label, recycled fibers, recovered fabrics, protective supplies, licensee, product responsible, protective clothing, protective textiles, and technical textiles, among others. And certain existing definitions are amended, such as that of a consumer, a manufacturer, and textiles themselves, among others. The display of the taxpayer registration number of the manufacturer, licensee, or importer is now mandatory. Procedures to evaluate compliance with the new NOM are also detailed. The option of adding labels with QR codes is included, but does not replace mandatory labels or other information that must also be included. It is now mandatory to specify that any contents from ornaments incorporated into the products under the new NOM must be included when the weight of such is more than 5% of the total product weight. It is important for manufacturers, importers, and sellers of the products regulated by the new NOM to familiarize themselves with the contents of this new standard and be ready to comply with the new rules beginning on the date the NOM enters into force. Note that any certifications and audit compliance reports issued under the current rules will continue to be valid as issued, and products audited under the current rules may be sold until current inventories have been exhausted. CCN attorneys Ramon Concha and Fernando Shenik write, Mexico amends income tax law governing sales of Mexican real property. On November 12, 2021, a decree amending various provisions of the Mexican income tax law and related regulations was published, becoming effective on January 1, 2022. The decree includes changes to Article 160 of the income tax law and establishes that for purposes of proceeds received from the sale of Mexican real property, the source of wealth is considered to be in Mexican territory when such property is in fact located in Mexico. This means that non-Mexican residents who pay taxes abroad are now required to pay Mexican income tax on income they receive from the sale of real estate in Mexico. Further, tax residents abroad may also be subject to the payment of Mexican income tax when they acquire real estate in Mexico. With respect to the income tax payable by foreign tax residents, the reform to the fifth paragraph of Article 160 of the income tax law provides that when the tax authorities conduct an appraisal of real property, which results in a valuation exceeding 10% of the amount of the purchase price, the total difference will be considered as income to the purchaser residing abroad. The tax will then be determined by applying a 25% rate on the total of such difference, with no deductions allowed, which must be withheld by the seller if the seller is a Mexican tax resident or a foreign tax resident with a permanent establishment in Mexico. In this manner, the seller will take on the purchaser's obligation to make the required tax payment. Thus, the obligation becomes a joint responsibility of the seller and the purchaser. It is important to note that the amendment is consistent with the provisions governing gratuitous property acquisitions, which also generate a 25% tax on the value of the agreed consideration charged to acquiring parties who reside abroad.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of the CCN Mexico Report podcast. Subscribe to the CCN Mexico Report newsletter at www.ccn-law.com to receive the full text of this edition's articles. This podcast is copyrighted 2022 by Cashoka Vasos & Newton, LLP. All rights reserved.